I'm Kara Infante, and this is Bookish Flights. In each episode, I chat with one bookish guest as we take some time to sample and savor the pairing recommendations from their bookish flight. We hope to give you suggestions to cultivate your TBR list and nurture your leisure time through books. In today's episode, I am chatting with Huda Al-Marashi. Huda is the author of the memoir First Comes Marriage, My Not-So-Typical American Love Story, and a co-author of the middle grade novel Grounded. Her other writing has appeared in various anthologies and news outlets, such as the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, and Al Jazeera. She is a fellow with the Highlights Foundation Muslim Storytellers Program and a public speaker. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Kara.
Hi, thank you so much for coming on with me today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yes, listeners, I got to meet Huda at a local San Diego author event here, I think about 2 months ago now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, about 2 months ago. And I had been wanting to do a San Diego author spotlight coming up for season 2 here. So I was so excited to make her acquaintance. Why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are?
I am, as you said, I'm a local San Diego author. We've lived here for about 6 years.
Okay.
I am a mom as well. I have a 21-year-old son, an 18-year-old daughter, and a 12-year-old boy.
Wow.
And I am an Iraqi American, and that identity is a big part of my work and the topics that I write about. And the writing hat then does take, between mom and writer, I think those two titles sum me up pretty much perfectly.
Yeah. Yeah. With your busyness, I imagine with your kids, how do you find time to write in your day?
The writing life and motherhood have always been tied together for me.
Okay.
I did not even have a writing life before I became a mom. It was really something born of motherhood. I think every mom relates to that feeling of just giving so much to your children and just being so in it. And at the end of the day, that hunger for something to belong to you. And in the beginning, that was just reading. Reading was that little break that I stole for myself. But anybody who loves words, I think also fantasizes about putting their own words down on paper. And I just remember this question kept popping up in my head, like, well, what if I could do this too? What if I could do this too? And it started very small, just with the journal, and literally me asking myself this question, like, is this something that I can do? And the thing that I couldn't get over, which seemed to be the biggest hurdle, was just giving myself permission to write. And I know so many aspiring authors just really struggle with that, because it does feel like this very strange thing, if you've never done it before, to steal away time from such a busy day to open up a notebook and just write. Like, who are you writing for? What does it mean? And I see, and it's so fun for me now that I've been in the business for so long, to see other writers in that same stage. And I think, oh, I recognize that, and it really is just making a decision and giving yourself the permission to write. That's the big turning point. And I got there in small baby steps. I got there in very small baby steps, just by taking one class at a time. First, it started with a 1-day class, and then it was an online class, and then it was kind of a critique group. And as the years pass, you just kind of step into this role of allowing yourself to be this person.
Sure.
And the structure of motherhood actually was helpful, because I made rules for myself.
Okay.
So when my kids were in preschool, the rule was that was my writing time.
Okay.
Because it's hard to run errands with kids, but that was my rule. Like, I had to go to the grocery store. I had to run errands with the kids. I could do that. It wasn't impossible, right?
Yeah. It's so easy to fill the 3 hours that they're gone, right, with other things. So you have to maintain that. Yeah.
And I would think, like, how much easier would my life be if I would just allow myself to run my errands and to cook dinner and to do all these things while they were at school. But that was my framework for myself, was kids go to preschool, you go to the coffee shop and write. And, because it's a 2-3 hour slot. I didn't even have time to go home. Right.
Yeah. You don't want to waste the time
and
to
you didn't
drive
want to
home.
waste the time. Yes. And I've adhere to that quite religiously, that school hours are my writing hours. And I try, like, of course, as they got older, things have crept in, but I try very, very much to live by that.
Yeah.
Still, I'm still dragging my my poor 12-year-old to the grocery store with me. And sometimes I feel guilty because I'm like, he doesn't want to be here, but I have to treat like 9 to 3 as my job.
Yeah. And I remember, or even now, like I'll ask my husband for some time on the weekend to work on the podcast. And it's the same. I usually will stay here because maybe I have a recording. And so I can't do that at the coffee shop. But I'm like, you can't even do housework. Like I have to like program my brain. Yes. It's like, no, you just sit here. You're giving this gift of time right now. You're going to sit here and you're work on the podcast or read the book for an upcoming episode. So maybe it is more leisurely. But maintaining that structure of your time is really important in the busyness.
Absolutely. And it's just a mental shift of giving yourself permission to block out that time.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So when you were starting in the beginning, I know you mentioned that you had done some journaling and then you took this 1-day course, and it almost sounds like this relationship, right? Of it, like this gentle touch point where it just became a bigger and bigger portion of your life. But did you know you were going to do memoir? Were you drawn to that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I had studied history before I got into creative writing, and I thought I wanted to be an academic. Okay. And that thought never left my mind. It was kind of like, okay, I have to get back to graduate school. I have to get back to graduate school. I have to become this professor. And after I had my first child, I thought, okay, I'm not going back to graduate school. My husband was in training to be a resident, and anybody who's been become a physician. So he was a resident. Anybody who's ever been in that kind of a relationship knows that partner's gone. The hours were so long, and there was just no question of us sharing any of the responsibilities, childcare responsibilities. And so then the question I asked myself was, well, what else can I do with these skills?
Yeah. And,
in studying history, we read a lot of primary source texts, and sometimes we do read firsthand accounts. Okay. And so the way I kind of like tiptoed into this kind of creative writing space was to ask myself, well, what would a primary account look like for, a Muslim woman standing in a post 9/11 world?
Sure.
And what type of things are relevant to us right now? What is the things that I would want to say? And so I very much had that in mind when I was writing, that trying to write, what would a primary text look like? And so I don't think I've gotten very far from mining my life for larger themes and things I want to say, even in my fiction.
Yeah.
I still end up coming back to these very large frameworks that I'm trying to be in conversation with about the immigrant experience, about the Muslim American experience, and about living in diaspora, having this kind of mythical homeland that you don't have a relationship with, but you're trying to maintain some sort of connection with. And
and do you try to bring those traditions, I'm assuming, to your children as well, right? Like you're trying to spread this down into your family.
Yeah, I'm trying, and not probably very successfully, right? And that is part of the diaspora story too, which has been interesting for me to observe, is that my relationship with this is changing so much, because first I was the daughter who was trying to hold on to something for her parents. And now I'm the parent who doesn't have that much left to give to her children.
Sure.
Because my perspective has not been, there's a term they use in immigration studies of ethnic replenishment, communities that had ongoing immigration got this kind of replenishment of people
Okay.
coming in from abroad and bringing in
Sure.
ideas, or maybe consistent travel. And the Iraqi American community specifically did not get a whole lot of ethnic replenishment
Yeah.
because of, we did have a lot of immigrants arriving that has kept our community vibrant here, but
Okay.
us kids who were growing up in diaspora didn't have a lot of travel back and forth during summers, whereas children of other, Arab countries might have. And it's been disheartening and sad to watch too. The other countries that have joined this conversation that have become difficult to travel to. In my childhood, my Syrian friends were maybe the ones that we kind of envied because Syria was the safe place that even Iraqi families would go to meet. And it's like, okay, well, this is a place where we can both get to and we can meet, and that will be our meeting point. And that's not the case anymore. And so they're going to have these struggles that we're kind of having, where there's just not as much travel and you're not getting that kind of cultural infusion that you might have had. Yeah. And so, my tie to that land was already tenuous. And then I don't have a lot of opportunities to reinforce that for my children. So what I am trying to provide to my children to take the model of other immigrant communities that have been in America in a long time, and that we'll look at like an Italian American community where there's still a sense of pride and connection to their heritage, and that can be a thing for us as well. That the Arab American identity is a thing as well, and it might not be as country specific as it used to be for our parents.
Yeah. I asked, my husband is Cuban actually, and so he's kind of experiencing exactly what you said, right? Like he's first generation on his dad's side. His mom, he's second generation, but I see them trying to maintain that Cuban heritage, right, within our family, and he wants to do things with our kids. But I think he'll talk about Christmases with his grandparents back when he was growing up and how it was so infused with that. And now we live nowhere near family. So it's him and I like trying to recreate this, and just how hard that got down, as like you said, generation by generation, you get further removed, and it's a country you can't go to. I mean, I guess you could, being military, right? He cannot. So, but it's very similar, but they, like you were saying, I think they try to maintain the pride in their culture and
another thing that's really worth noting is the can mean different things, right? The can travel, because let's say even if you have the travel lines are open, it's safe to travel, you're able to travel, but that doesn't mean you are financially able to travel. And that is another thing that I don't think that I am also always interested in exploring in this kind of immigrant relationships and stories, is that there's a great financial strain for 100%. Immigrants when they come to this country. They're trying to get their foothold, trying to establish, they're sending money back home. They're also trying to maintain this relationship in going back home to visit. That can be an extra, $10,000 a year that's just flying out of their pockets just to keep their relationships alive. So how do you, start to create this generational wealth that we talk about, this investment in these places, when you have this thing that you have to maintain back and forth. And then some families can't. And then maybe they're just sending one person back. Maybe it's just one parent is going back. Not everybody can afford to go back. And that's a very real consideration as well.
Yeah.
And then assimilation is going to look different for them. And that's how come assimilation takes place at different paces for different families and different people. Yeah. And I'm always very sensitive to that, right? When we're talking to immigrants, the assumption is like, oh, you must speak your parents' language. And this is a huge source of shame for a lot of children in immigrant families who have not been able to master that language.
Sure.
And it's not entirely up to them, it's going to depend on their parents' level of education, how comfortable they were with the English language, how much they were able to travel back. And so something I try to do in my work, and this is a theme that I do circle back to so often, is that we have to not make it so value-laden. right?
Yeah.
Like it's lovely to want to preserve your culture,
Sure.
but there is no shame in assimilation. Some of these forces are larger than us,
Yeah.
and we're all just doing the best we can. And it is ultimately a losing battle. The
Yeah.
longer you stay in one place, you're going to end up speaking that language. That is your language. There is nothing wrong with
Yeah.
that. This is a story as old as time that people have traveled and become absorbed into the communities around them.
Yeah. I think that's so beautiful what you're saying, because it just that perspective, right, of everybody's different. And I think that's so important to remember. We can't walk in each other's shoes. We can try to empathize and we can hear stories and we can listen, but it's
Right,
all a spectrum.
especially for families in the 1970s that were coming to this country. And I mean, the culture around bilingualism was just that it wasn't possible. So, they were getting here and they were getting to school. And what were they hearing from the teachers and educators was, don't talk, if you want your children to learn English, don't speak to them
Yeah.
in your native language at home. You're going to hold them back. Well,
Yeah.
this family sacrificed so much to get here, to get their children to get ahead. Are they going to do anything that's going to hold them back?
Yeah.
So no, they all tried. They all did what they thought was right,
Yeah.
you know.
Wow. I
And
love
now we know,
this.
that children have this
Yeah.
amazing capacity to learn languages, but that just wasn't what was advised. It wasn't what
Yeah.
was recommended then.
And that's what my grandmother, my family's Italian, and I studied abroad in Italy. And so when I went, I'm like, "Oh, grandma, do you remember any Italian?" And she was like, at that time, my family, we didn't speak any Italian because they were trying to assimilate into America and they didn't want to be seen as different.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So everybody's journey is different. I love that. You brought up one other point that I thought was really beautiful about moms and trying to find something that is your own, right? Because we talked before we got on the show, like we might move for our husband's jobs or we might be pulled into a stay-at-home mom role, and then you're looking to gain a foothold, right? To use your word, but to find yourself again. And I loved what you talked about of like, okay, well, what is my skill set? And I think I just wanted to reiterate that point because I know we have a lot of moms that listen to the show, but if you're a mom and you're like trying to figure out what it is you want to do, take a look at what your skills are and don't think of like, I used to think, okay, I was a physical therapist and I can only think in that physical therapist mindset, but my skills can go to so many other things. And so what I asked myself was, what do people call me about? What could be my other skills? What do people look for me for information? Or what other things am I good at? And so I would ask myself those type of questions. And that's how I came about a podcast about books versus physical therapy. But I just loved what you said because it was very similar questions I asked myself when I was trying to dig myself out of that trench of like, I was just mired in being a mom, but I knew I needed something that was mine.
Absolutely. And I think that's the thing. The key is the knowing that you need something that's yours and giving
Yeah.
yourself permission to have that, right? And that you
Yeah.
deserve to have that. And that having that one little thing that is yours is actually a gift to your family.
Yes.
Because you will be a better person to your spouse and to your children is if you just filled up that cup a little bit.
Yeah.
And how we get to what that one thing might be is going to be different for everybody.
Sure.
Right? For me, it was to take a look at like, I knew I needed something in an intellectual life. I knew that was just who I was before becoming a mother. So when I quieted the voices within me and asked like, well, what is that one thing that I would dream of doing, that like if I felt like I could only do one thing in this life that would make me happy, and this thought like, oh my God, if I could write a book, that would be amazing, and so then it became this thing that I dangled in front of me to aspire and to reach towards. But I think it could look totally different for everyone, right?
Yes.
I am not a physical and in my body person. Exercise is always going to be a real challenge for me. And I really think I'm just wired differently. I swear I don't even get like that endorphin payoff that other people get that motivates them.
The runner's high.
The runner's high. It's just not, I don't even have that chemistry. I don't even know what that is. But for somebody who does get that little thing, that it might be something you might need to be in your body, not in your head, right? Yeah. That one thing that you do for yourself. Yeah. And so I think it could look different for everybody, but it's in the framing that that you allow yourself to make space for something, because it would be lovely if it was enough to just caregive, but that is also buying into this myth of motherhood that's been romanticized and that's stripped also of the actual labor of caregiving. And that's the real conversation I wish we were kind of having as a society, because motherhood is just one hat. And then the older we get, we end up caregiving for our parents.
Sure.
If we don't learn this balance of doing something for ourselves to keep our sanity, it's not like it goes away just because your kids get older. It'll come back.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, like I said, I just wanted to highlight that point because I think it's so important. And you hit the nail on the head there, is giving yourself the permission to explore what that might be for yourself.
Yes. And I've had this conversation with a lot of my mom friends, and it doesn't have to be something grand like, I want to be a writer. I need to write a book. It just has to be something that makes you feel good. Something that feeds a little bit of your soul.
Yeah, I actually had back in like the 20s or early 30 episode, I had a gentleman come on actually named Tanner, and he talked about writing in a journal at the end of the day and write like essentially 3 things that filled your cup that day and 3 things that like zapped your energy. And if you do that over time, you will start to see that might be one way to start to kind of figure out like what really does make you feel good.
That's a great tip. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that I remember my husband about a year and a half ago, he'd be like, okay, I'll take the kids, go do something. And I had been so like mired in that motherhood that I was like, I don't even know what I like to do anymore. Like literally and we had just moved here. So I'm like, I don't have friends. I don't know what I like to do anymore. Like, you're giving me time, but I literally don't know what to do with myself because you've gone for so long without having the time.
Oh, so absolutely. It's the most subsuming experience out there. You don't even know what you like. You don't even know what you enjoy.
Yeah. Yeah, because I haven't had the time to do any of those things for many years.
And there's other challenge that mothers face. It's like, you give me 2 hours and I'm so overwhelmed by everything I want to squeeze into those 2 hours that nothing. I feel extremely dissatisfied after those 2 hours because I was so confused. I didn't even know where to start, So,
and you didn't feel like you checked anything off the list.
Exactly. And sometimes you're just tired. And I think what helped about having this thing that I wanted to pursue is it also took, when I did have a window of time, it took away the question of what I was going to do with it. Yeah. And it just gave me this thing that I was going to chip away at.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. Okay, moms, that little bit was for you.
Yeah.
So, and speaking of your writing, because we're still kind of on that topic, what have you learned about yourself through writing?
Well, I think for a memoirist, it's an endless journey of self-discovery, right?
Sure.
Because we are writing about ourselves. But when I got into it, like I've shared, that kind of interrogating this Muslim American identity, the Arab American identity, the bicultural identity. I had all these big words in my head that this is what I was doing with this work.
Sure.
And, writing it, even in the beginning, I think I had it in my mind that this is what I was showing. So I kept writing into these corners. But the gift of writing memoir is that you have to keep, going deeper and digging through the layers. And it really helped me kind of unearth myself within that equation. And, I think one of the larger takeaways of First Comes Marriage is that, the character that I wrote of myself was so kind of caught between this Western romantic story and then the story she had grown up hearing from her family. And she was somewhere caught in the middle and trying to figure out where she fit in that story. But living through it and getting to the end, she was forced to see herself in it, that she actually had a hand in making these decisions, and that realizing that not all people lived the bicultural experience the same way, that not everybody had the same desire to please, the same desire to live by those rules, that some people chose to kind of push back against them. And so what was it in her? What was it about her personality? And so, writing that book really made me contend with my own struggles as a people pleaser, my struggles with decision making. And I never would have gotten into this memoir thinking I was writing anything about decision making, but life is a series of choices, and how we choose influences and impacts everything. And so much of this book and who I was in this book and during that time period of my life was not just about getting married, but also marriage being the first adult decision I made in my life. And me not knowing who I was as a decision maker.
Sure.
Now I know what I struggle with in making larger life choices, that I am somebody who can ruminate. I am somebody who could look back. I am somebody who can get a little bit caught up in regret.
Sure.
And that's not something I knew about myself when I was 18 and choosing to marry the son of our closest family friends. And I couldn't even recognize that I had this pattern of just wanting to do what my parents wanted either. I didn't have the language for that. So in many ways, writing First Comes Marriage actually gave me a more mature understanding of my place within my culture and within my community. It made me more forgiving of my family. That's also the real gift of writing memoir that I offer to anybody who's thinking about kind of working within that genre, is that it is an invitation to really sit with every relationship in your life, and to do so in a loving way, because to create a character out of your family members is almost with the lack of arrogance, like to play God, right? You're trying to create them on the page, but you also have to create them with that same kind of mercy. You have to look at what was their motivations, what were they trying to do.
Sure.
And I think if you don't take that step when you're writing memoir, it does show as well. And those memoirs are not as successful, because it does come across as somebody having an axe to grind, rather than somebody just kind of trying to tease apart what brought them to a certain place.
I love what you said. You talked about this when I went to your talk and also in your book, but that memoir is its own kind of fiction. And I would never, being not a writer of memoir myself, I would never think that it is a work of fiction. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I just love that.
It's an absolute tension that we dance with. Absolute tension, because here you are spending day after day trying to dig and to be your most honest self, right? To share the most absolute truth you can about this time in your life. And the most successful memoirs really just get into the heart of what you were thinking, what you were feeling. You have to be so raw and so honest, but at the same time, you are absolutely creating a reality. You are absolutely plucking from a lived experience what you chose to include and what you chose to leave out. And you are doing so in order to say something. And it is this funny thing that it's this total act of honesty that is also a bit of dishonesty. I have to write certain people out of scenes because it would weigh them down for them to be in there, and that's not what I'm trying to show. A memoir also requires, sometimes you have to make composite characters, because it would become way too cluttered if you mentioned every girlfriend you've ever had. So maybe you might create one friend to represent the voice of kind of the friends in your life. And of course, these are things that memoirists will own up to, kind of in their author's know, and kind of point to you where they had to play with things, because they're also, we have to fulfill many requirements. We have to make a readable story. Our day in and day out life would be absolutely boring.
Yeah. Mine too.
And so we're only trying to pluck out the relevant bits to show what we are trying to show. And I know the reality, though, of my life, that it's so much larger than this. And if I had wanted to say something different and to show you something different about that same time period, I absolutely could have.
Yeah.
I absolutely could have even just written my husband out of it. And that story could have been a story about me and my mother. And I played with that a lot. Like, is this really about me and my spouse, or is this really about me and my mom, and her example, and me wanting to do it right by her?
Yeah.
And it's something that's even hard to sit with sometimes, because it is so true and so real, but so not real at the same time.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have conversations with people about the book, and they'll say things to me like, "Oh, I feel like I know so much about you because I read your book." And it's like, no, you know what I chose to show you.
Sure.
And then how I chose to show it to you as well. Because
is there any sense of, because I imagine obviously writing a memoir is a very vulnerable experience as well. And so when you are, like, exactly what you're saying, you're picking and choosing the stories to say what your overarching message is, does that help with the vulnerability piece at all? Because you're still being honest, like you're still writing that into that page. But I'm wondering if that softens maybe the blow of, like, just I'm really opening myself up to be read, my life.
and if you notice, right, when I talk about the book, I can only refer to myself in the book as she, because I created a character out of myself, and I don't really see myself as her anymore. And I was very much trying to show a certain thing about not about our cultures, about our community, yes, but also about newlywed angst and disappointment in the early years of a relationship. I was seeing my friends around me kind of struggling with this experience, and I thought, I have something to say about that, and I can use my life to say those things. So that act of standing outside myself and having this thing that I was trying to show, and making this character a she and stepping outside of her, absolutely helped with the vulnerability. Yeah. The other part is that it is so heavily edited. The first drafts and the first stage of memoir, you really have to write with the door closed. And this is like a very common and very good piece of writing advice for fiction and nonfiction. Close the door, but don't let anybody in the room with you, and pour out everything that you need to pour out, everything that you would think would be relevant. And then you don't let in the voices, the scary voices of like, oh my God, what if my mother reads this? That would be so embarrassing. I would die. They're not in the room with you yet.
Because it's so true.
Like, so true.
Could be easy to let that overtake you.
Oh, and then you'll never get anything on the page. It'll paralyze you. It's in the second stage of writing, which is probably all of writing is revising, is another thing we say. Like, most of the work really happens. That's when you kind of crack the door open a little bit, and you ask yourself, okay, what is the story really about? And even in memoir, we have to follow the same conventions of fiction, in that our main character needs to have a want. They need to have a desire. There needs to be conflict. There needs to be tension. And they have to start somewhere, and they have to get somewhere.
Yeah. Okay.
So then that parameter comes in, and now you get to take out the things that don't belong. Now, some of the things, the embarrassing things, the things you don't ever want to read, anybody to ever read, naturally just go away because they don't fit the story that you've decided to tell. Some of the stuff has got to stay in there, and then there's this reckoning and the reconciling, though, that feels healthier and feels good, because you know why it's there, and it's there because it's serving the story.
Yeah.
Anybody who's read my memoir knows I have very intimate moments in there, and they were so difficult to write. Like, I just felt myself squirming inside. um, as I wrote them. But then as I revised them, it just became more technical and more clinical and more about, okay, what is this serving? And there were some moments that very thankfully, gleefully, just didn't need to be in there. And I'm like, okay, this gone. And I don't have to feel guilty about, like, it's not that I'm trying to hide it. It's
Yeah,
that it really didn't belong in there.
sure. Okay. Oh, I like that so much. I'm imagining you like digging the hole, right? You're digging it as deep as you can, and then you're getting further and further away from it, like each step through the revision process. Like, nope, okay, yep, that's there, serving its
There.
purpose, and that really changes.
Absolutely. And, like this is a very, my husband, it's personal for him too.
Yeah.
And I waited till the very end before I showed it to him because I thought, well, why make him worry about stuff that may
Yeah.
never make it in there? And also, I knew if I opened the door too early and got judgment in too early, it would derail me.
Yeah.
That would be it. I would hear those voices and I would never be able to get back to the computer again because, as I discovered in the book, I really struggle with being a people pleaser. And so
Yeah.
if I had to face the displeasure of everybody in my family too early, I don't know that I would have been able to finish.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, well, I love it. I just finished it this week before my mom came in because I knew that once my mom got here, I'd be spending time with her. But listeners, first comes marriage. I would highly recommend this book by Huda. It is so good. Okay, I would say let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk about who you are as a reader and what genres you enjoy.
I still love memoir,
Okay.
and I do like to read a lot of, I also like literary fiction. I read middle grade because I also write middle grade books. And I do like a lot of psychology and self-help because I do think that that really kind of informs me as a memoirist and as a creative writer too, is to just kind of think about family dynamics, relationships,
Yeah.
all those things are just fodder for what we do.
Yeah, I love that. And how do you find time to read? Like, how do you fit that in your day?
You know, I'm glad you asked that question because I do want to talk about reading slumps and to make them
Yeah.
okay. Reading is a huge part of what I do. You can't write without reading. You have to kind of feed the voice. And even though it's such a big part of my life, I do have seasons where it's very hard for me to read.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of my author friends go through the same thing and struggle with it. So I just want to put it out there that even writers sometimes have reading slumps.
Yeah.
And just like I have the writing days for writing when my kids are in school. So if I have any downtime in the evenings, that's the time where I would like to read. And
Yeah.
so that's the hours that I would build into my day for that. But yeah, some seasons are harder than others.
Yeah. And I think that's so true, right? Of just sometimes the busyness of life gets to you. And you're like, yeah, I remember that a couple months ago, I was looking back and I'm like, oh, I only read 4 books this month, which to some can seem like, but to me, that was really a slower. And I'm like,
A slower season for
but yeah, I
you.
think just
Yeah.
there was just so much going on.
There's a lot of things competing for our attention.
Yeah.
Sometimes, like there's been times where the news cycle is just so depressing and overwhelming. It can make it hard to
Yeah.
quiet your brain to read. And
Absolutely.
there's a lot of good storytelling on television that competes for our attention. I'm not a huge watcher, but I know that that's
Yeah.
something that like a lot of my friends talk about competing for their attention. And I don't even know that that's even all that much of a bad thing because some of the storytelling is so good. It can also
Yeah.
be very inspiring for writers as well.
Yeah.
So
I think it goes back to kind of what you're saying though, is giving yourself permission to do the things that you know that you need to do, right? If reading is not filling your cup in that moment, don't force it, right? I mean, like recognizing within yourself what you need and giving yourself the permission to do that.
It's very much parallels the writing life too, because that's another thing that's gotten this myth that you have to be writing every day. You have to be producing all the time.
Yeah.
But most of us writers have real dry spells too, where we're not writing anything new, or the things we are writing aren't gelling. They don't feel great. They're not working out.
Yeah.
And we have to be able to ride those seasons without making judgment about it and thinking it says something about us. Like, oh, I guess I'm no longer a good reader, or I'm no longer a writer because I haven't written. God, it's okay. Even if you didn't pick up for a pen for a year and want to get back to it, you're allowed. You're allowed.
Yep. Like you said, it's your life. It's a series of choices. Give yourself permission to like make the choice for yourself.
Yeah.
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 So, and then you have also been so gracious to prepare a book flight for us today. So can you tell us a little bit about how the books pair together?
Yeah, as a writer, one thing that I have always thought was the greatest gift of actually pursuing the writing life is not necessarily even the things that I've written, but the people I met along the way.
Yeah.
The writing community, the community of authors is, they're just the most incredible type of people. They're people who read, they're people who have big ideas, and they're so supportive. I think there's a myth about a lot of creative industries that you have to know someone to get somewhere. So many of us knew no one, but then we became those somebodies for each other just by being available, being supportive, being willing to read each other's work, share each other's work. So the bookish flight I prepared for you today actually just tells the story of my writing life and the people along the way who've helped me out and gotten me to where I am today. And I've always said, like, if I never wrote another word or published another book, this whole experiment would have been worth it to me just because of the people it brought into my orbit.
Yeah.
So the first book I want to share with you is, if you remember, I mentioned like my very first writing class.
Yes.
And it was an online class, and my kids were very little, and it was taught by this incredible Palestinian American writer, Susan Moadi Daraj.
Okay.
And it's called A Curious Land. It's a collection of short stories that are connected, and it tells the story of a village in Palestine. And of course, it's extremely timely right now.
Yeah.
And I can't even emphasize enough that when I saw Susan's name as the teacher of my course, that I took that actually as a sign that it was okay for me to do this work. It was my very, very, very first foray.
I have the chills.
And I had never met another Arab American writer. And I didn't even know, how we were talking about giving ourselves permission. I didn't feel like I had permission to do this kind of work. I didn't think it was something that a good Arab American girl would do, was to kind of probe these things. And well, there's a whole lot more of us now. Back then, Susan was one of our pioneers, and she has continued to be such a supportive writing mentor, and she's one to watch. She has a book coming out in January, I think, with HarperCollins, called Behind You Is the Sea. And it's also, I think, going to be a connected stories about a Palestinian family.
Wow. Okay. Definitely have to look out for that one.
That's my first one.
Okay.
So now I take my first class with Susan, and I'm kind of dabbling a little bit. Then this was when I lived in New York. And then I moved to Ohio, and I was kind of faced with this question again, like, is this something I'm really going to do? Is this really something I'm going to try? And I signed up for my first, a public fiction workshop that was happening, hosted by Cleveland State University. And I remember I walked into that workshop and I said, if the workshop instructor says one good thing about my writing, then I'll stay. Like, that was the rule I made for myself. And I'll keep trying to do this thing. And he did. He said something kind, and it kept me coming, and it kept me coming some more. But the greatest gift of that workshop was meeting this author, Laura Maylene Walter. And the book I'm recommending is Body of Stars. This is her debut novel, and it's a fascinating concept where women are born with markings that foretell the future. And
Wow.
how would that play out in this kind of dystopian society? And she did a really wonderful job with it.
Okay.
And so we started writing in coffee shops together. And then from another workshop, Laura pulled in another very talented writer, Jennifer Marie Donahue, who
Okay.
writes short stories that you can find online. And hopefully one day will be pulled together in a collection one day soon.
I love
But
it.
you can find her short stories in multiple magazines online, and they're all curated together on her website. To this day, this is my go-to writing group. I call them
Okay.
my writing soulmates in
Yeah.
the acknowledgement of my books. There
I love
is
that.
nothing I write that these two women don't read first and give me feedback on. And I wouldn't be anywhere I am without them. They recommended where I could try to submit things. And the thing is, I can hold up their books today and point to their stories in their magazines today. But when we first met, none of us had anything to point
Yeah.
to. And we just stuck in it together and shared our knowledge together and also offered each other this openness of, you can send me anything at any time and I will read it.
Yeah. And so it sounds like you guys were in your journeys were kind of on the same trajectory. Like you were in the same spot when you all met, which just seems like a ripe ground to create a group like this. And that's beautiful.
Absolutely. And that's another thing I would throw out there is that's what you want to find.
Yeah.
You know, you will become established authors together, but in the beginning, you need to find somebody who is at the same stage as you because you have the same kind of openness,
Yeah.
same willingness to read. Now, somebody who's already around the curve is not going to have the same kind of time to build you up with you, but
Yeah.
that's the gift of having the peer group.
Yeah.
So, we started
That's a
with the
good way of putting
teacher.
it. Yeah.
This is my peer group. And then I want to share books by another author who was a little bit ahead of the curve for me, but who also provided tremendous support. I met
Okay.
Honoré Fanon Jeffers at a writing workshop called Aspen Summer Words in 2015, and she just happened to be
Okay.
my roommate. And
Wow.
she was an established poet. She wrote this tremendous poetry collection called The Age of Phyllis about Phyllis
Okay.
Wheatley. That's beautiful. But when we met, she was also working on her truly epic, sweeping saga, multi-generational saga called The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois. Such a gorgeous book that even Oprah picked it.
It is such a beautiful
And
cover.
it's a beautiful cover. It's a book of, I just feel like life itself is in it. It's a book of
Okay.
everything. It gives you this whole sweeping scope of Afro-Indigenous history, and how it played out and how plays out into modern times. And it's a story of ancestors and their descendants. And we don't see that framed often enough, but she makes you really beautifully feel our connection to our ancestors and how it will play out in our
Yeah.
lives
So
today.
that one it's a novel. It's not because you said she's a poet, correct?
She's a poet. So
Okay.
now this is her first novel. And
Oh, so cool.
oh, poets who
Okay.
go on to write novels always write the most beautiful novels because line for line, their prose is so lyrical.
Yeah.
So, and this is gorgeously written.
Okay.
And so she, when my book was coming out, she was a little bit ahead of the curve, more experience than me, had been in the business a long time, and she gave me some really good talking tos. I was so terrified because I was writing a memoir. I was
Sure.
terrified to share. I was
Yeah.
terrified to even announce that the book was coming out. When it sold, I hadn't even told anybody in my family because I figured if it doesn't get that far, I don't need to let anybody know.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
she had some real good conversations with me. And I remember one time her telling me like, God gave you a gift, and it would be a sin not to use it. Like,
Yeah.
just own it. It's okay. You're not doing anything wrong by doing this work.
Yeah.
And I think and it was her push that got me to share it the first time on social media. I had I had no internet presence. I had no life online. And
Yeah.
I needed somebody who had been around the curve before to kind of tell me
Yeah.
what I needed to do and how to step into this place.
Yeah.
And then the final uh, thing that I will add to the landscape of the literary community is that there's some authors that just do this gift to other authors by reviewing their books. And
Yeah.
I was so touched and moved and fortunate to get a review in the Washington Post. There's very little review space left anymore, right? We have
I'm
less and
sure.
less newspapers out there, less and less. Uh, and my book came out from a small press, so to be reviewed in a major newspaper was such a big deal. And
Yeah.
so the author who offered me that kind review was E.J. Levy. And then,
Okay.
of course, I started to follow her work because this is just like the literary landscape now.
Yeah.
And she wrote this gorgeous book called The Cape Doctor. It's historical fiction, and it
Okay.
tells the true story of Dr. James Miranda Barry, who was born a woman, but who lived her life as a man in order to go to medical school and practice medicine.
Oh,
And
wow.
her prose is line for line, absolutely gorgeous
Okay.
as well. And I think that's a really underlooked but beautiful part of literary citizenry is other authors read your work and share your work, and we wouldn't be anywhere without each other. None of us
Yeah.
would.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. It makes me think of that saying, right? And I think I'm totally going to butcher it, but of like, we all rise together, essentially.
absolutely, absolutely. And you would think it's a competitive
Yeah.
landscape, but I haven't found it to be that way at all. And I stand here and I'm talking to you because of all these other authors. And it was hard to even pick just this handful. I could keep going. I
Yeah.
could keep going. Yeah. I would not be where I am today without so many other authors who brought me here.
Yeah. I love the community piece of that too, because I think way back to what we talked about in the beginning of that part of motherhood, it can also be isolating. And so now you have this vibrant community that because you gave yourself permission to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And also offered yourself to it,
Yeah,
right? You have to give a lot to get anything
absolutely.
back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I love this so much. So, thank you so much for our book pairings today here for the flight. How I love to end the show is what I call our bonus pairings, and they're just a speed round of questions. So, you can answer these really quick. Are you a rereader?
I'm not actually. I feel like there's too many good books out there, so I just keep going. But I'd love to become a rereader because there's some books out there that I really do want to reread.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel you on that. Time is limited.
Yeah.
So, and then what is one book you've read that has changed your life?
Ah, this is I'm gonna go with one of the very first books, like a childhood book. It was called
Okay.
Noisy Nora by Rosemary Wells.
Okay.
And it was just like the first time I saw what books can do because it's like a noisy middle child. And that's who I was. I was a middle child. I was struggling. I was feeling unseen in my family. And it was like I read this little short story and it was not just me. And your listeners can't see this, but I actually brought you the copy. Like I've kept it
Oh
all
my
these years
goodness. I love
because
it.
it inspires me
Yeah.
to think like this is what we're doing with our books is that we are helping people to feel seen.
Yeah.
So
I
yeah,
love that. Thank you for sharing. Where is your favorite place to read?
on my couch.
Nice
Yeah,
and comfy.
yeah,
And then
cozy.
lastly, what are you reading next?
The next book up on my list to check out is a friend of mine from the Highlights Foundation.
Okay.
Her middle grade debut just came out. It's called Tagging Freedom by
Okay.
Runda Rumani, and it's about graffiti artists during the Syrian Revolution and the role that graffiti played in getting out their message. And it's for young
Wow.
readers. It's a middle grade book. So it's how
Okay.
young people used graffiti art to send a political message. And I haven't started it yet, but I
Okay.
am really looking forward to reading that next.
Yeah, that sounds very intriguing. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I know your time is precious and I appreciate all you've given me.
Oh, it's my pleasure being here. Thank you for the wonderful conversation.
You are welcome. Thank you so much for listening to this episode today with Huda Al-Marashi and her book flight of books from authors that helped shape her writing life. You can find all the books that we talked about today at bookishflights.com. That is also where you can find more information about today's book flight or other books that we talked about. I want to inspire a community of readers. So whenever you share a post about what you are reading or what you are reading next, especially if you have heard about it on the show, please tag us on Facebook or Instagram at Bookish Flights. If you enjoyed the show, please head over to Apple Podcasts and leave a review. Your review not only helps the show, but it also helps the podcast to reach others. Make sure you are subscribed on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to make sure you will not miss an episode. That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. As Emma Thompson said, I think books are like people in the sense that they'll turn up in your life when you most need them. Cheers to you, dear readers. Until next time.